we can go ahead and get started. All right, welcome everybody. We are working through 1 Samuel. Been reading through that. We're in 1 Samuel 24 through 27. So we're gonna be ambitious. We're gonna try to get through 4 chapters tonight. So we're gonna go quick tonight. So it's gonna be a little faster pace than we have been as we've been going usually about 3 chapters tonight. So let's go ahead and begin with the word of prayer. Heavenly Father, thank you for this day. Thanks for bringing us together. Thank you, Lord, for protecting and providing for us, and just help us to trust in you, to follow you, no matter what's going on around us. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, so just in your groups with the people that are around you, I'm going to have you guys online do the same thing. Why don't we share on this first question is, who is someone that you would bend over backwards, as the expression go, to help them, and why? Who's somebody you'd bend over backwards to help them, and why? And I'm going to let you guys share online. I'm going to mute this so you're not heard here. As we look at that, so this kind of interesting thing to think about of just, you know, there are some people that in our lives that we'll do pretty much anything for if it's in our power to help. There's some people there. So let's go now to 1 Samuel chapter 24. Can somebody read for us verses 1 through 7? If you're in the room here, I've got a microphone. If you're online, I'll make sure you can be heard in the room. So, all right. Somebody online want to start us off? Happy to be able to do that.
I'm still opening my book, but I can. Oh, okay, here it is. All right. David spares Saul's life. Can you hear me okay? Because my headset's not working. Okay. After Saul returned from pursuing the Philistines, he was told, David is in the desert of En-Gedi. So Saul took 3,000 chosen men from all Israel and set out to look for David and his men near the crags of the wild goats. He came to the sheep pens along the way. A cave was there, and Saul went in to relieve himself. David and his men were far back in the cave. The men said, This is the day the Lord spoke of when he said to you, I will give your enemy into your hands for you to deal with as you wish. Then David crept up unnoticed and cut off a corner of Saul's robe. Afterward, David was conscience-stricken for having cut off a corner of his robe. He said to his men, The Lord forbid that I should do such a thing to my master, the Lord's anointed, or lift my hand against him, for he is the anointed of the Lord. With those words, David rebuked his men and did not allow them to attack Saul. And Saul left the cave and went his way.
So David is hiding in a cave near En-Gedi. And last week I showed you some pictures. En-Gedi is this place where what's the right word I'm thinking of? Water comes out of the rock. Springs. A spring. There's a spring, yeah. So a spring that's there, water comes out of the rocks down through the little ravine and then goes towards the Dead Sea. So it's a little oasis in the wilderness. There's rocks and mountains all around. It's talking about this crags of the wild goats. The wild goats they're talking about there are actually called ibex. So it's a kind of, just kind of a goat-like creature that's there. And they're still around there even to this day. You can see them there. And so Saul is pursuing David. They come to this place. Saul's men know this area and they know Saul's coming. So they go inside of a cave. They go deep inside of the cave and they're basically waiting for Saul and his men, 3,000 soldiers to pass by. So they're outnumbered. They can't go ahead on conflict. Does anybody remember how many people David had with him at this time fighting men? 400 somebody started with, and then it grew to about 600. So yeah, so 600 against about 3,000 is not very good odds. These are Saul's best men, and as good as David's men are, that's still not very good odds. They're outnumbered 5-1. And so David and his men are going to hide in the cave. They're going to wait for Saul and his guys to pass by, move on to a different area before they come out. But Saul goes into that very cave because he needs to use the bathroom. He needs to relieve himself. and he's looking for a place to do that in private. As the king, I guess he wanted a little more privacy, so he goes in there. And David's men are like, I can't believe that Saul just came into our cave alone and unguarded. All right. And so David goes up to Saul, stealthily, creeps up behind him, and he cuts off a corner of Saul's robe. Saul is not aware of David's presence there. It's dark in the cave. David is doing this very quietly. He cuts off the corner of Saul's robe. But David later kind of like almost regrets even doing that much, because he says he shouldn't harm the Lord's anointed, and even that could be seen maybe as a threat. So God chose him, he basically says, so who are we to harm the Lord's anointed? That's not our place, right? God chose Saul, and so we owe him our allegiance and our loyalty and our devotion and our obedience, as long as he is the leader that God has set in place, and we should not do anything to undermine that. That is that is David's kind of view of the anointed position here. God chose Saul, so we choose Saul. So that's where David's mindset is. Okay, let's keep going. Can somebody read for us 8 through 15? All right, Ed, you got that for us?
Afterward, David also arose and went out of the cave and called after Saul, my lord the king. And when Saul looked behind him, David bowed with his face to the earth and did obeisance. And David said to Saul, why do you listen to the words of men who say, behold, David seeks your hurt? Lo, this day your eyes have seen how the Lord gave you today into my hand in the cave. And some made me kill you, but I spared you. I said, I will not put forth my hand against my Lord, for he is the Lord's anointed. See, my father, see the skirt of your robe in my hand. For by the fact that I cut off the skirt of your robe and did not kill you, you may know and see that there is no wrong or treason in my hands. I have not sinned against you, though you want my life to take it. May the Lord judge between me and you. May the Lord avenge me upon you. But my hand shall not be against you. As the proverb of the ancients say, out of the wicked comes forth wickedness, but my hand shall not be against you. After whom has the king of Israel come out? And after whom do you pursue? After a dead dog? After a flea? May the Lord therefore be judge and give sentence between me and you, and see to it and plead my cause and deliver me from your hand.
All right, thanks, Ed. All right, so what does David do, and what's his message? And there's maybe a lot here to think about, but as soon as Saul goes out of the cave, maybe a safe distance away, David comes out with his men, and he calls after Saul and says, hey, Saul, look what I've got. Check your pockets, right? Check your robe. You see, I've got a piece of it right here in my hand. This is how close I was to you. I had a knife in my hand. I didn't kill you. I could have. If I wanted you dead, Saul, I could have done it. God put you at my mercy. This proves that David isn't trying to bring Saul down. That's what he's going after here. He calls God as a witness and a judge. You notice that? May God judge between me and you. If I've done any wrong to you, so be it. But God judge between me and you. I will not harm you. God might, for your wickedness, basically David's implying, right? Out of the wicked comes wickedness. God might judge you for your wickedness, but I won't play the executioner. And then finally, notice David compares himself to a dead dog and a flea, right? He's humbling himself. He's being a good diplomat here. He's saying, I'm not worth all this fuss or all this trouble. Saul, you don't need to come after me like this. This is, he's trying humility, diplomacy to diffuse the situation. This takes courage, as Saul wouldn't listen to reasonable words in a situation we talked about last week. Remember Elimelech the priest? Where Elimelech said, hey, I didn't have anything to do with David. I didn't know. I've done this for David, countless times. I had no idea that David was on the run from you. I was loyal. Did Saul listen to him? No, he had him killed. And so this takes courage from David, knowing, because David knows that story. Remember, one of his sons, the only one of his family to escape, has come and now been one of David's men, right? In the cave with him. So David would know firsthand that Saul hasn't listened to reason in the past. It also takes probably that much more control over his men and restraint, knowing the kind of wrongs that Saul has done to some of his men. Right, because this son of the priest of Elimelech is there in the cave. Abiathar is there in the cave with him. He would have wanted vengeance upon Saul for not only killing his dad, but his entire family. And so David's restraint over his men, I mean, that's a pretty strong loyalty they have to David, that they're willing to listen to him and not go after Saul. Even not only just because of their love for David, but also some of their personal wrongs that they've experienced at the hands of Saul. All right. Any thoughts, questions, comments before we keep rolling? Like I said, we're going to go a little faster pace tonight. Yeah, Saul could still kill David's men, in the midst of this. They're outnumbered 5-1. If makes peace with David, comes there, he could still kill all of David's men for insubordination or whatever else. Remember, these are people that are on the run from Saul for one reason or another.
You have to wonder what the men were thinking back in the cave. And David goes out, Saul, here I am.
Yeah, when David's like, okay, I didn't kill him, but I'm going to go talk to him right now.
Yeah.
Right? I have this great hiding place, but I'm going to give myself away. Tommy, the men probably were wondering what, like you said, what on earth is David thinking?
They can't get out.
Yeah.
If they come out, they're going to be ambushed by Saul's men.
Yeah. And so this trust in David and just this willing to do for David almost anything, it seems. So they had to be wondering and thinking, what's going on? All right, let's keep going. Can somebody read 16 to the end of the chapter? It's 16 to 22. Thanks.
As soon as David had finished speaking these words to Saul, Saul said, "Is this your voice, my son David?" And Saul lifted up his voice and wept. He said to David, "You are more righteous than I, for you have repaid me good, whereas I have repaid you evil. And you have declared this day how you have dealt well with me, in that you did not kill me when the Lord put me into your hands. For if a man finds his enemy, will he let him go away safe? So may the Lord reward you with good for what you have done to me this day. And now behold, I know that you shall surely be king, and that the kingdom of Israel shall be established in your hand. Swear to me, therefore, by the Lord, that you will not cut off my offspring after me, and that you will not destroy my name out of my father's house." And David swore this to Saul. Then Saul went home, but David and his men went up to the stronghold.
All right, very good. Thank you, Judy. All right, so Saul responds to David. He recognizes David's righteousness and his logical argument, and he acknowledges that David is more righteous than he is. And you notice he asks David not to wipe out his house, right? Which I think speaks more to the character of Saul than it does to David's character, right? David hasn't shown any of this vengeance to this point anyways, or any of this idea of retribution or wanting to take out Saul or his family, right? He's married to Saul's daughter. He's best friends with Saul's son. He's already promised Jonathan this very thing, right? But I think it speaks more to Saul's character, because what would Saul do in this situation? And what's he trying to do? He's trying to cut off any enemy that he has, anybody else that might try to come after the throne, right? And so I think his request, I think, speaks more to his character than it does to David's. And then Saul returns home, where David, it says, goes up to the stronghold, not just the strongholds around this area, but the stronghold, probably talking about Masada again. That David returns to the stronghold of Masada, a place that's defensible. 600 men could easily defend it against 3,000, as long as they had enough food up there, because they could have the water probably from cisterns that were maybe already there in David's day. All right.
It's interesting that David doesn't go home with Saul.
David does not go home with Saul. He acknowledges or accepts Saul's apology, if that's what that is, but he knows it's not safe. Right? And I think sometimes for us as Christians, sometimes we need to forgive. We need to be gracious. We need to love others like God does. But at the same time, that doesn't mean it's okay to perpetuate injustice and put yourself back in a position where you or people around you might get hurt, right? Just because you've forgiven someone of something doesn't mean it's always safe to reconcile. We want to work towards that. I think David would have loved nothing better than to be reconciled with Saul here, but he knew that it wasn't safe yet at this point. David wasn't holding it against Saul, but it wasn't safe for them to reconcile. All right, so let's keep going on unless there's a comment or question or a thought. All right. I'll go ahead and read this next section here. We get a transition statement at the beginning, kind of an interesting, almost footnote, even though it's kind of a major big deal of what we're going to hear as this goes into this next area. Okay. Now Samuel died, and all Israel assembled and mourned for him, and they buried him in his house at Ramah. Then David rose and went to the wilderness of Paran, and there was a man in Moab whose business was in Carmel. The man was very rich. He had 3,000 sheep and 1,000 goats. He was shearing his sheep in Carmel. Now the name of the man was named Nabal, and the name of his wife Abigail. The woman was discerning and beautiful, but the man was harsh and badly behaved. He was a Calebite. David heard in the wilderness that Nabal was shearing his sheep. So David sent 10 young men. And David said to the young men, "Go up to Carmel and go to Nabal and greet him in my name. And thus you shall greet him. Peace be to you, and peace be to your house, and peace be to all that you have. I hear that you have shearers. Now your shepherds have been with us, and we did them no harm, and they missed nothing all the time they were in Carmel. And your young men, and ask your young men, and they will tell you. Therefore let my young men find favor in your eyes. For we come on a feast day. Please give whatever you have at hand to your servants and to your son David." All right. So this chapter begins with almost a kind of an aside that says, Samuel died and they buried him and Israel mourned for him. Right? This was the major player for the first part of the book of Samuel. And it's almost an aside here that his life now has come to an end. I think it's a further transition here of, all right, it's the time of the judges has passed. It's now the time of the kings. And we move into this next section. So David goes then and he asks for food of this guy named Nabal. And so what we know about him is he's a Calebite. If you remember, Caleb was one of the chiefs of Israel, and he was of the tribe of Judah. And this goes to the time of Joshua. So Caleb and Joshua were the two spies that went into the land of Canaan with the other 12. Caleb from Judah, Joshua from Ephraim. They were the only two that gave good reports. You know, hey, yes, this is, you know, there's good fruit, there's good things in the land. Yes, there are people that are large and warlike, but God will deliver them for us. Let's go up and take them. That was Joshua and Caleb's message. The other 10 said, no way, we can't do it. And the people listened to them. And so Joshua and Caleb, of all the people that came out of Israel that were 20 years and older, they're the only two that got to walk into the promised land. And Caleb was given this land as his inheritance. And so this guy is a descendant of Caleb. He's wealthy, and he's married to his wife Abigail, who's beautiful, and she's wise, she's discerning. Right? And so David goes and asks for food. He sends 10 of his men, right? He could have, all 600 of them could have shown up and said, you have to feed us, right? And David could have like imposed this by force or whatever else. But David entreats this guy. He asks this guy, he sends a delegation to give honor and peace to him. The greeting is of peace. But he does have these men remind Nabal, hey, you had all of your herds out in the wilderness. You had all of your servants that were out there, and we protected them. We kept them safe. We didn't steal from them. They didn't fear from bandits or raiders or wild animals. We kept them safe. And you got to think, as a shepherd, David would have found value in that personally, having gone up against bears and lions and things as a shepherd. To have those around him that were protecting him would have been a huge advantage for him. Of the safety that they experienced, not to mention there would be no loss of property, right? And so you got to think about these thousands of animals. He's shearing them. He's taking their wool. Nabal is. He's going to profit greatly. He's already wealthy. He's already rich. He's already throwing a feast for all of these workers. David asks for some of that as well. As I showed your men kindness, now show me kindness. This is this hospitality culture, right?
One thing,
Yeah.
parenthetically, the Carmel they refer to is not Mount Carmel.
Correct.
It's just a small town.
Correct.
In that area.
So Tom, just making sure we're aware that this is, if you're familiar with the land of Israel, you know that on the northern side, the northwest side of Israel is Mount Carmel, where later you have Elijah battles the prophets of Baal. It kind of is right there on the Mediterranean Sea. This is not that Carmel. This is a different one. This one is very close to Hebron, kind of in the south. So south of Bethlehem, just even a little bit south of Hebron in the territory of Judah. Thanks for that note, Tom. Make sure we're all on the same page there. I will show a map. Shock, I know. I will show a map, but I'll do that a little bit later on tonight. All right. So David asks politely. He's expecting a yes, almost demanding a yes here for his hospitality, but it's what would have been done and what would have been normal in the culture for returning one kindness for another. All right. So can somebody read for us 1 Samuel 25, 9 through 13? Are you willing to do that, Michelle? Yeah.
When David's men arrived, they gave Nabal this message in David's name. Then they waited. Nabal answered David's servants, "Who is this David? Who is this son of Jesse? Many servants are breaking away from their masters these days. Why should I take my bread and water and the meat I have slaughtered for my shearers and give it to men coming from who knows where?" David's men turned around and went back. When they arrived, they reported every word. David said to his men, "Put on your swords." So they put on their swords, and David put on his. About 400 men went up with David, while 200 stayed with the supplies.
Great. Okay. So Nabal's response. So it's they waited. So this seems to be not just a rash response from Nabal. This seems to be a calculated and measured response. So it's not just Nabal's like, yeah, no, go away. I don't want to deal with you guys. They waited for his response. And so he thought about it. But he insults David and his men, and he will not provide hospitality, right? So it's not only an insult to David's men. Well, many servants are breaking away from their masters these days. It's not just the saying, well, you guys are just going around throwing people's names around. It's also an insult against David. Because what's he saying? Oh, you've broken away from your master, David. You've broken away from Saul. Why should I take care of you? Who are you, David? You're just some rebel. You're just some guy who doesn't know about loyalty or service, right? And so he's insulted David's honor, his integrity, and really everything that David stands for. And so David's response is he's ready to kill Nabal and all that Nabal owns, all the males, for his insult, which maybe is a rash response from David. We'll find out as we go along here. All right, so let's keep going. 14 through 22, I'll go and read this part. But one of the young men told Abigail, remember Abigail is Nabal's wife, "Behold, David sent messengers out of the wilderness to greet our master, and he railed at them. Yet the men were very good to us, and we suffered no harm, and we did not miss anything when we were in the fields, as long as we went with them. They were a wall to us both by night and by day, and all the while we were with them keeping the sheep. Now therefore know this and consider what you should do. For harm is determined against our master and against all his house, and he is such a worthless man that one cannot speak to him. Keep going. And Abigail made haste and took 200 loaves and 2 skins of wine and 5 sheep already prepared and 5 seahs of parched grain and 100 clusters of raisins and 200 cakes of figs and laid them on donkeys. And she said to her young men, go on before me, behold, I come after you. But she did not tell her husband Nabal. And as she rode on the donkey and came down under the cover of the mountain, behold, David and his men came down toward her, and she met them. Now David had said, surely in vain have I guarded all that this fellow has in the wilderness, so that nothing was missed on all that belonged to him. And he has returned me evil for good. God do so to the enemies of David, and more also. By morning I leave so much as 1 male of all who belong to him. All right, so let's pick up there.
Seems like this isn't the first time Nabal has irritated somebody and the young men have said, Abigail, you gotta do something.
Yeah, so this probably isn't the first time. It sounds like the servant is willing, right? So a servant is willing to go behind his master's back to his mistress, right? To the lady of the house. And remember, the women of the house in those days, there were very much segregated duties, but the women of the house were really the household managers. They were the ones that kept all of the produce. They were the ones that were responsible for making sure the food was baked, bread was baked, the food was there, but also made sure that the bread, that the grain that was harvested, the produce that was harvested would last all the way through to the next harvest. So they were really more like household managers. And so the servant goes to her and says, this is what Nabal did, and this is who he did it to. And I think we're in trouble if something doesn't happen, right? Because this guy doesn't know that David's going to take out not only Nabal, but all the male servants, but this guy's in as much danger as Nabal is if nothing happens. And so he's willing to go behind his master's back, and he urges her to act to save them from Nabal's foolishness.
Well, he almost has to, because as he says in verse 17, he's so ill-natured,
Right, which is an interesting, right? That's a pretty bold move for a servant to speak to the master's wife. He's foolish.
He knows that the master's wife already knows that.
This is, you're probably right. Abigail knows her husband here. And there's probably no love lost at this point between them. And that's probably obvious to all the servants. I think you're exactly right on that, Tom, as they go. But the servant is still willing to do them. I think that speaks to who Nabal is and also to the relationship that he and Abigail have. He calls his master worthless. And just a kind of a good literary note. This is the same word that the author of Samuel uses to describe the sons of Eli as worthless. Remember, these are the guys that are basically extorting people out of the sacrifices, that are sleeping with people, women that are coming to offer sacrifices, that take bribes. It's also the word that's used to describe the men that will not acknowledge Saul as king, who don't give Saul a gift, who scoff at the word of the Lord spoken through Samuel that Saul will be their king. The word has been used 2 times already in the book of 1 Samuel. One of the sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, and one of these worthless guys that won't hear the word of the Lord as Saul as their king. And we know what happened when to Hophni and Phinehas. So we'll see what happens now. So Abigail, she quickly takes action, and she provides for David's men. Notice that of all that's on hand, right? This is a very wealthy family. So Nabal is not denying David because he has a lack of resources. He is denying David because of his own pride or his own foolishness or wickedness. That's why he's denying David, not because there's a lack. Because he just takes what's on hand, and it's literally enough to feed a small army, which is what David has. And she goes, sends the servants off to give this to David, and then she comes right behind them to intercept David and his men. And notice who she doesn't tell. She doesn't tell her husband. Again, she's, and it's not that he would have maybe known even right away or maybe ever, because she's the one that's in charge of the household. She's managing that. And David, we learned here that David intended to do to Nabal is to kill all the males in his household because Nabal returned David's good with evil. He returned evil for the good David sent to him. All right, questions, comments, thoughts before we finish this section here, or move on to this section, I should say. Kind of a lot to unpack in here. All right, let's keep going. Can somebody read verses 23 through 31? All right, Michelle, get to the microphone here. 23 through 31.
When Abigail saw David, she made haste and alighted from her donkey and fell before David on her face and bowed to the ground. She fell at his feet and said, "Upon me alone, my Lord, be the guilt. Pray, let your handmaiden speak in your ears, and hear the words of your handmaiden. Let not my Lord regard this ill-natured fellow, Nabal, for as his name is, so is he, Nabal." Nabal means fool.
Nabal needs fool, yeah.
And folly is with him. But I, your handmaiden, did not see the young men of my Lord whom you sent. Now then, my Lord, as the Lord lives, and as your soul lives, seeing the Lord has restrained you from blood guilt and from taking vengeance with your own hand, now then let your enemies and those who seek to do evil to my Lord be as Nabal. And now let this present which your servant has brought to my Lord be given to the young men who follow my Lord. Pray forgive the trespass of your handmaiden, for the Lord will certainly make my Lord a sure house, because my Lord is fighting the battles of the Lord, and evil shall not be found in you so long as you live. If men rise up to pursue you and to seek your life, the life of my Lord shall be bound in the bundle of the living in the care of the Lord your God, and the lives of your enemies he shall sling out as from the hollow of a sling. And when the Lord has done to my Lord according to all the good that he has spoken concerning you, and has appointed you prince over Israel, my Lord shall have no cause of grief or pangs of conscience for having shed blood without cause, for my Lord taking vengeance himself. And when the Lord has dealt well with my Lord, then remember your handmaid."
All right, she's as crafty as David with words. All right, David did a good job with Saul of diffusing the situation. Abigail is just as skilled with her words and her argument here. Abigail, sorry, I lost my place there. Abigail calls Nabal a fool, right? This is her husband. And Nabal is a word that means fool. So whether this is a nickname or whether this was his given name and his parents just didn't like him, I'm not sure, but his name means fool or foolish. And so she calls on David not to take vengeance into his own hands, but just as he's done with his other enemies, especially Saul, to let God avenge, to not stain his own hands with blood for his own name, for David's own name's sake. Despite the Lord's battles, David, don't fight your own. Let God fight your battles for you. You just fight God's battles, right? Don't do something, David, that you'll regret when God delivers all your enemies into your hands. And then she says, when God gives you what he's promised, look with kindness upon me, right? And so just well-worded, well-crafted, and the movement of her whole speech just really diffuses David. Looks like David to call on his own character, his own experiences, and point to the Lord and look to the Lord for deliverance, just as he always has. And so Abigail just does a beautiful job of confronting David, of intervening in this situation. Any thoughts or questions here?
I think this tells us we need to be careful what we name our children.
Be careful what we name our children. If you name them fool, they might be a fool, right? So yeah, be careful what we name our children.
I'm reminded of Governor Hogg of Texas, who named his daughter Ira.
I'm a hog.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
That
was her name. Yeah, well, there you go. Yeah, so yeah. So it's parents sometimes do things to their kids without even realizing it. Yep. All right. So let's keep going on. 1 Samuel 25, verse 32, excuse me. And David said to Abigail, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of Israel, who sent you this day to meet me. Blessed be your discretion, and blessed be you who have kept me this day from blood guilt and from avenging myself with my own hand. For surely as the Lord, the God of Israel lives, who has restrained me from hurting you, unless you had hurried and come to meet me, truly by morning there had not been left to Nabal so much as one male." And David received from her hand what she had brought him. And he said to her, "Go up in peace to your house. See, I have obeyed your voice, and I have granted your petition." And Abigail came to Nabal, and behold, he was holding a feast in his house, like the feast of a king. And Nabal's heart was merry within him, for he was very drunk. So she told him nothing at all until the morning light. In the morning, when the wine had gone out of Nabal, his wife told him these things, and his heart died within him, and he became as stone. And about 10 days later, the Lord struck Nabal, and he died. All right. So David responds, he blesses Abigail. He praises her from taking the vengeance away from himself, his blood guilt away from himself, what he was going to do. She kept him guiltless. And then he does accept gracefully and peaceably what Abigail has offered to him. And then Nabal, when Abigail tells him what was going to happen or what had happened, the next day, he, whether it's from shock or a heart attack or the Lord intervening through one of those things or something else, his heart becomes like stone within him. And 10 days later, he dies. It says the Lord did that to him. It was a consequence from what was going on. Again, whether shock or a heart attack or whatever that means. But I think it's interesting when Abigail comes back, Nabal is feasting like a king, which again shows he has more than enough. She's taken all the stuff that was on hand, gave it to David, and he still has enough to feast like a king. So it's not that he didn't have this to provide David. It's purely just ill intentions, and shows, I think, his heart and his foolishness that he doesn't provide for David. Okay. And the Lord strikes him.
I really wish when I read this in English that I could read Hebrew. Because it almost sounds like what it says when the wine had gone out of him. It almost sounds like he had a really bad hangover. And then his wife comes in and says, "Oh, by the way, David was going to kill you."
Yeah.
And all of our men.
Yeah.
And the guy's like,
Yeah, so it's just, she's wise enough not to do this while he's drunk. Wine makes one foolish and not hear or listen to things. She waits till the morning. Maybe Tommy does have a hangover or something like that, but the wine, he's not impaired anymore with the alcohol inebriety. He might be suffering the consequences of the morning after, but he hears her and he is struck by that. Again, whether that's shock, whether that's a heart attack, whether that's the Lord or all of the above in some manner or way. But 10 days later, he dies. All right. Let's read the rest of this account. Linda, would you read that for us? 39 to the end of the chapter.
When David heard that Nabal was dead, he said, "Blessed be the Lord, who has avenged the insult I received at the hand of Nabal, and has kept back his servant from wrongdoing. The Lord has returned the evil of Nabal on his own head." Then David sent and spoke to Abigail to take her as his wife. When the servants of David came to Abigail at Carmel, they said to her, "David has sent us to you to take you to him as his wife." And she rose and bowed with her face to the ground and said, "Behold, your handmaid is a servant to wash the feet of the servants of my Lord." And Abigail hurried and rose and mounted a donkey, and her 5 young women attended her. She followed the messengers of David and became his wife. David also took Ahinoam of Jezreel, and both of them became his wives. Saul had given Michal, his daughter, David's wife, to Palti, the son of Laish, who was of Gilead.
All right, thank you. All right, so we kind of wrap up this section here. David, after he hears of Nabal's death, he praises the Lord. One, for the Lord using Abigail to keep him guiltless, but for continuing to avenge him is how he sees this. And then he sends messengers to Abigail to offer marriage. She accepts, she goes with him, she joins David's company. But then we also hear David also marries Ahinoam of Jezreel. And David has some advantages from these marriages. He gains the wealth of Abigail, and is also building a coalition in Judah, right? Strengthening his position in Judah, the tribe where he's from. And he has a marriage alliance with someone from Jezreel. And I'll show you where Jezreel is on the map. It's a city in the Jezreel Valley. This is the northern part of Israel. This is not a place where we hear of David being or going there a lot, but it's a strategic point geographically in the north that really connects the northern tribes with the rest of the tribes of Judah. So through this marriage, he's building relationships with the northern tribes and really trying to consolidate his power, his influence, and his connections. So let me show you just what I'm talking about here, just with a map. So let me go here. Okay. So not this map here. I know it's kind of small. But again, you see the Mediterranean Sea on your left. Whenever you're looking at a map of Israel, look for your major landmarks. The Mediterranean Sea is there on the left. Then next you want to look for either the Sea of Galilee or the Dead Sea. The Dead Sea is the one here in the south, the southern end. It's the longer of the two, the river. And then if you go farther north, you see the Sea of Galilee. It's a small little lake there. And then the Jordan River runs south from the Sea of Galilee down to the Dead Sea. And then you can orientate yourself. If you go to the top of the Dead Sea and just go a little bit over to the left towards the Mediterranean Sea, that's where you always will find Jebus or Jerusalem. On this map, it's the little white spot right where it's where my mouse is pointing, but so Dead Sea, Sea of Galilee, Jordan River flows this way. Top of the Dead Sea, over about a third of the way is where Jerusalem sits. You go south there to Bethlehem. Hebron's down here, and so Carmel is right there. So he solidifies here in the southern area through the marriage to Abigail. And then up here is the Jezreel Valley, with Jezreel is about right here, kind of controlling this trade route, both north and south, and the east and west, is what the Jezreel Valley controls. Now this map is, what I'm showing you is really, this is labeled the kingdom of King Saul. So the green shaded areas are the areas that Saul was able to keep under control, that he ruled over. You notice the part between, that it's brown, between the Mediterranean Sea and over on the coast. That's Philistia, the coastal plain. Saul was never able to drive the Philistines out or take over or, enslave them or rule over them. And so he battled with them his whole kingdom, his whole reign. In the north, you see it's not a solid block of green, but you have this green outline here, both in the Jordan River Valley and the Jezreel Valley. Those were major trade routes, and because of that, those were contested all of Saul's reign. There wasn't strong control over those or hold over those. Next week, when we hear about how Saul dies, he's fighting up here in the north, trying to control that area. And so kind of the kingdom's divided a little bit. Everything on the right-hand side, you have over on the right-hand side of the Sea of Galilee. That's called the Transjordan. Those are where 2.5 tribes were living. Saul had some run-ins with Ammon, if you remember, and then Moab and Edom are farther down here. And then he's had some dealings with the Amalekites down here as well. And so this is kind of where that's at, but where the geography is. But David is really solidifying the tribe of Judah where he's from, right? He has the luxury of time that Saul didn't, to kind of build those relationships before he's king. And I really believe this marriage to Ahinoam of Jezreel is really a political marriage as much as anything else. He's trying to strengthen ties with the northern tribes. See, I'm not just of Judah. I'm not just for the Southerners. I'm for all. Like even my wife. I have family now up in the north. Okay. All right. Any question? Oh, and then we got the note about what does Saul do? Saul gives, right, his wife Michal or Michal, Saul gives her to another man. Essentially, Saul divorces his daughter from David in doing this. And so he basically is disowning David as his son-in-law. And so, yeah, Saul goes back his own way. You know, he's not angry with David anymore. He stops pursuing him, but he still holds much animosity towards David, so much so that he gives David's wife, his own daughter, who loves David, right? Gives her to another man to be his wife in the midst of this. So Saul's conflict with David is not done. Remember last week we read and heard how, or 2 weeks ago, how David became Saul's enemy. Not that David did anything, but Saul made David that way. That's how he viewed him and how he treated him. Okay. All right.
I'm guessing Michael would have no say in any of that.
Yeah, the question is, would Saul's daughter Michal, would she have had any say in the matter? We're not told that she does. We're not told that she puts up a fight. We're not told that she likes this or doesn't like this. But culturally, no, she would. I mean, one, it's her dad making a decision. Two, it's the king. And because of that, yeah, she would not have had any say in that. Although legally, according to the law of Moses, right, according to the Torah, this is not a valid reason for divorce or anything else. This is Saul doing his own thing again. And so whether or not she puts up an argument, we don't hear about that. But Saul doesn't care. Now, the only defense you can make for Saul, and I don't think it's a strong one, is that David left from what he heard from Michal. He threatened Michal, his wife, and left, right? So that's what Saul heard happened because she was trying to protect herself from her dad, right? So that's the only defense you could make for Saul in this one instance with, you know, maybe he felt like he was justified because, well, David threatened her, but he didn't really, you know, so who knows, you know, as you look at that. So. That's a great question. It depends on what the situation was with heirs and brothers and some of those other things, but she would have had, it seems that she had influence and control over a lot before he died, and then afterwards, she may have still retained at least some of that for a period of time too. It's possible, depending on what their family relationships were, right? But there is that connection in this village city. She seems to be well thought of and respected by the servants and all of that. So there are a few times, it wasn't the norm, there are a few times we hear of daughters inheriting from their fathers. It's when there aren't heirs or there aren't male heirs that are there. The other thing is if she had children with Nabal, then that's still theirs, but she's the mom and it would be under her control until they grew up. So those are some of those pieces that are there. And we know what happened culturally, but sometimes in the specific instances, it was different. Yeah, but it seems that he has this influence that's there, although David doesn't go and live there. So she might not have had the land or anything like that. So we don't know for sure on some of those pieces. Okay. All right. 1 Samuel 26, 1 through 12. Somebody willing to read that for us? And get through our other chapters here. I'll go ahead and do this one. All right. Then the Ziphites came to Saul at Gibeah, saying, "Is not David hiding himself on the hill of Hachilah on the east of Jeshimon?" So Saul arose and went down to the wilderness of Ziph with 3,000 chosen men to seek David in the wilderness of Ziph. Sound familiar, doesn't it? All right. And Saul encamped on the hill of Hachilah, which is beside the road on the east of Jeshimon. But David remained in the wilderness. When he saw that Saul came after him into the wilderness, David sent out spies and learned that Saul had come. Then David rose and came to the place where Saul had encamped. And David saw the place where Saul lay with Abner, the son of Ner, the commander of his army. Saul was lying within the encampment while the army was encamped around him. Then David said to Elimelech the Hittite and to Joab's brother Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, "Who will go down with me to the camp of Saul?" And Abishai said, "I will go down with you." So David and Abishai went to the army by night, and there lay Saul sleeping within the encampment, within his spear stuck in the ground at his head, and Abner and the army lay around them. Then said Abishai to David, "God has given your enemy into your hand this day. Now please let me pin him to the earth with one stroke of the spear, and I will not strike him twice." But David said to Abishai, "Do not destroy him, for who can put out his hand against the Lord's anointed and be guiltless?" And David said, "As the Lord lives, the Lord will strike him, or his day will come to die, or he will go down into battle and perish. The Lord forbid that I should put out my hand against the Lord's anointed. But take now that spear that is at his head and the jar of water, and let us go." So David took the spear and the jar of water from Saul's head, and they went away. No man saw it or knew it, nor did any awake, for they were all asleep, because a deep sleep from the Lord had fallen upon them. I like this one better even than the cave account. I think it's right. So who betrays David again? Well, Saul does, but the Ziphites betrayed David to Saul. These are the same guys that did it the first time. These are people of Judah, but they betrayed David again. So we see here that Saul also kind of betrays him, right? His reconciliation with David that we just read about a little bit earlier, it's just temporary, isn't it? Right? The peace he made in chapter 24, he's now pursuing David full bore again, brings 3,000 of his choicest men to go after him. And so David sends out he's got his guys, he knows the territory. He's got, even though the Ziphites aren't with him, he's got other friends in the area. And they find out where Saul and his army have camped. So Saul, he goes to spy out the camp. And Abishai, the brother of Joab, goes with him. Now, if you don't remember Joab, I don't know if we really heard about Joab too much yet, but Joab is going to be basically the commander of David's forces. When David is king, Joab is the commander. He's the general. And so Joab is the one that is in command and control. He's the one leading the forces of David. He's the military commander. And so Abishai, his brother, Joab's brother, goes with David. We hear about him later as well in 2 Samuel. And so David won't harm Saul, or he won't allow Abishai to do it because he says no one can harm the Lord's anointed and be guiltless. But notice what he also believes. He believes Saul will one day die and I'll become king. He's either going to die by God striking him, or he'll die naturally, or he's going to die in battle, right? But I will not lay a hand on Saul. And again, to prove his good intentions and his conviction in this, he won't let Abishai take the spear and drive it through Saul to the ground. But he says, no, take the spear, take the water jug, take his, his cup by his bed, and let's take that and let's get out of here. And so they do that, and the Lord protects David and Abishai through all of this because the army's in a deep sleep surrounding them. They had to creep through probably tents and sleeping guards and everything else to get to where Saul was at. And so that's what has happened here in this first part. Can somebody read now for us 13 through 20? Is anybody willing to do that? All right, Pat, thank you.
Then David crossed over to the other side and stood on top of the hill, some distance away. There was a wide space between them. He called out to the army and to Abner, son of Ner, "Aren't you going to answer me, Abner?" Abner replied, "Who are you who calls to the king?" David said, "You're a man, aren't you? And who is like you in Israel? Why didn't you guard your lord the king? Someone destroy your lord the king. What you have done is not good. As surely as the Lord lives, you and your men deserve to die, because you did not guard your master, the Lord's anointed. Look around you. Where are the king's spear and water jug that were near his head?" Saul recognized David's voice and said, "Is that your voice, David, my son?" David replied, "Yes, it is, my lord the king." And he added, "Why is my lord pursuing his servant? What have I done, and what wrong am I guilty of? Now let my lord the king listen to his servant's words. If the Lord has incited you against me, then may he accept an offering. If, however, men have done it, may they be cursed before the Lord. They have now driven me from my share in the Lord's inheritance and have said, 'Go, serve other gods.' Now do not let my blood fall to the ground far from the presence of the Lord. The king of Israel has come out to look for a flea, as one hunts a partridge in the mountains."
Very good, thank you, Pat. All right, so David calls out. He gets to a safe distance, and then calls out across the canyon or whatever separated the armies. He calls out to Abner. This is Saul's commander, Saul's general, and he says, "Abner, why aren't you protecting your king? You have failed. You are a great warrior in the land, but you deserve death for allowing someone to come in and that could do harm to the king." But he uses to prove his loyalty and his trustworthiness to Saul, because he says, "I could have killed you, Saul. I've taken your spear, I've taken your water jug. You were asleep. You were at my hands again, and I did not harm you. I protected you. I could have killed you, and I didn't." And so in the midst of all of this, David even offers, he says, "Saul, if this is a just cause that you have against me, if God's incited you to this, then let God accept an offering from me," right? A guilt offering. David knows it's not this. Saul knows it's not that. But David says, well, if it's other people, well, then let them be accursed, because they have taken me away from my inheritance. Right? Sometimes we don't think about what this actually did for David. It removed him from the inheritance of the land that God was supposed to give him, his family. It's taken him away from worship of the Lord, right? And it's driven him away from all of these things of what it means to be an Israelite. He can't go up and worship the Lord 3 times a year in Jerusalem. He can't offer sacrifices. He can't do all of these things or not Jerusalem, but with the priests. He's not able to do any of these worship and things that he's supposed to do to come before the Lord. I said Jerusalem, that's where it will be, but where they've stationed and set up these places of worship. He's not able to come and bring these offerings before the Lord. And so it's like he's been driven out. It's like he's been told, you have to go and worship other gods, even though David won't. Right. And,
Sounds like David was
taunting him, really. I mean, I don't think that's his intention, however, it could almost be interpreted.
So, the question is David taunting Saul, right? Is that what's going on? And so it's almost like David is trying so hard to explain something simple to somebody that's just not getting it. And so it can almost feel insulting, but I think for David, it's just, he's trying to be just completely obvious about how off the rails Saul is. Because when it comes to David, as we've looked at this before, Saul is not rational. And so David, I think, is making it as simple and as straightforward as he can get it of what Saul's actions have really done. Because really no one's inciting Saul to this. Saul's inciting himself. And so David's saying, Saul, you're doing this and this and this to me. But David's doing that in a polite way, not directly insulting or accusing Saul of that.
And he's really trusting in God to protect him, because Saul could get angry through all of that.
Saul could have got angry again and rushed his men across the ravine and attacked them head on. He doesn't, but he could have in the midst of that. Could have. All right.
David also, Saul also learned his lesson when he was in the cave. No one came in with him. Here he sleeps in the middle of the camp.
Yeah, so here, the comment from Ed was that Saul learned his lesson, that he's not going anywhere by himself anymore. So he's got all his men around him. But David still gets to Saul, which I think is not only to David's craftiness, but really, how does David get near Saul? The Lord, right? And so I think this really is a message for David, but also for Saul. For David, that, the Lord will be with you, but for Saul is a Saul. It doesn't matter what you do. You will not be able to stop or prevent David from doing what I want him to do. If I wanted him to kill you, it could happen, right? And I think it's also a message for Saul of how much God is with David and how much God is not with him anymore in the midst of these things. So to Ed's point, I think even though Saul learns his lesson, when you're going against the Lord, it doesn't really help you out no matter how wise you think you're being, if you try to go against the Lord, you're not gonna win.
Well,
Yeah.
And it also sounds like,
Tom.
that Saul is suffering from some kind of mental illness, because he's extremely bipolar. One minute he hates David, and then the next minute David goes to him and says, I'm your friend. He's, oh yes, you are my friend. I love you, I forgive you.
So Saul has this seemingly mood swings are back and forth with this of what he's suffering from, or how, it does seem that way, Tom. We don't know what or why or how. We don't know if it's trying to save face. We don't know what, because all his men hear the same arguments too, or if it really is a mental illness that he's struggling with. We really don't know. It's hard to diagnose from this day and age, but those things can point to that. Yeah.
This is like the third time I think this
Yeah.
has happened.
All right, so 21 to 25, I'm going to read that. Then Saul said, I have sinned. Return my son David, for I will no more do you harm, because my life was precious in your eyes to this day. Behold, I have acted foolishly and have made a great mistake. And David answered and said, here is the spear, O king. Let one of the young men come over and take it. The Lord rewards every man for his righteousness and his faithfulness. For the Lord gave you into my hand today, and I would not put out my hand against the Lord's anointed. Behold, as your life was precious this day in my sight, so may my life be precious in the sight of the Lord, and may he deliver me out of all tribulation. Then Saul said to David, blessed be you, my son. David, you will do many things, and you will succeed in them. So David went his way, and Saul returned to his place. Yeah, so we get this last interaction here. So Saul tells David to return, promises to do him no more harm. He blesses David. He tells him he will succeed. David affirms that his trust is in the Lord, that the Lord is the one that delivers David. Tells Saul to send someone to collect Saul's spear, because David is not going anywhere near Saul. And when Saul returns home, David doesn't go with him. He still returns his own way. He doesn't trust Saul. And he's not holding this against Saul, but he doesn't trust him. And we learn that from this next section here in 27.
And he really goes from the frying pan to the fire. He doesn't just go back to the wilderness, he goes to fast.
Yeah, and so as we read here, as you can see in your title, the David flees to the Philistines. So Saul says, I'm not going to pursue you anymore. David, you're my son. You are righteous and I am not. You don't have anything to fear from me. David hears the words, but with his experience, with the wisdom, with what he does, he doesn't believe him, because in this next section, he says, if I don't do something different, I'm going to perish at the hands of Saul. And so this is what we warn and we read here. And will somebody read for us 27 verses 1 through 7? Ed, you're going to do that for us? Thank you. 1 through 7 of chapter 27.
This is almost like a Grisham novel.
I love
Like Edmund comments, kind of like a Grisham novel, where you get all these twists and turns and this repeat, where do you go and what's the next spot through all of these things.
I love chapter 27 because it really shows how and crafty David is.
Yeah, so this does show the craftiness of David. Let me just show on the map here, just before Ed reads this next section here, just where we're talking about in the midst of these things. So, all right, so this is a kind of a close-up of all of this that's here. And so you have the wilderness of Ziph and the Ziphites, you have Carmel and Moan right below it. So Ziph and the Ziphites are here. Moan, Carmel, where Abigail's from there. And so it's up in this area that David is pursued by Saul, and you have this incident with the sword and spear. And then David here is going to go down over to Gath and eventually down over to Ziklag. So he's going to come from Carmel. He's been in Ziph. This is where this last chapter 26 goes. This chapter he goes over to Gath, and then he goes down to Ziklag. And at this point, Ziklag and Gath, they're outside. If I showed you that other map, both those cities are outside of the territory controlled by Saul, the territory controlled by the Philistines. All right, go ahead and 1 through 7 of chapter 27.
And David said in his heart, I shall not perish one day by the hand of Saul. There is nothing better for me than that I should escape to the land of the Philistines. Then Saul will despair of seeking me any longer within the borders of Israel, and I shall escape out of his hand. So David arose and went over, he and the 600 men who were with him, to Achish, the son of Maoch, king of Gath. David dwelt with Achish at Gath, he and his men, every man with his household, and David with his 2 wives, Ahinoam of Jezreel and Abigail of Carmel, Nabal's widow. And when it was told Saul that David had fled to Gath, he sought for him no more. Then David said to Achish, if I have found favor in your eyes, let a place be given to me in one of the country towns, that I may dwell there. For why should your servant dwell in the royal city with you? So that day Achish gave him Ziklag. Therefore Ziklag has belonged to the kings of Judah to this day. And the number of the days that David dwelt in the country of the Philistines was 1 year and 4 months.
All right, so this is the kind of the only time signature we can get in this whole account of how long this was. But David, he goes to Gath because he knows Saul can't and won't pursue him there. Saul's not going to risk a direct conflict with Gath, with the Philistines, on their soil, on their territory. He'll fight against them if they come into Israel, but he's not going into their territory. He doesn't think he can beat them militarily because he doesn't trust Saul to keep his word. And so he goes with them. He takes with him his 600 men and their wives, his wives, probably his men's wives as well. They're all in this entourage together. So you'll probably 1,000 people or more that are all together in this area. They've got the baggage. They've got maybe even herds or flocks that they're keeping to feed themselves when they're able. And so he goes there. This time, if you remember the last time he went to Achish, he drooled in his beard and was crazy and wrote on the walls to try to escape. The difference is now David has a small militia with him, and it's probably known about how much Saul has been trying to hurt and kill him. And so Achish is thinking, well, the enemy of my enemy, as the saying goes, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And so they're not singing songs about David killing Goliath anymore, or David his tens of thousands. There's been some time removed from David and his even defeats over the Philistines, his victories over the Philistines. And so it seems Achish is willing to play nice and looking for an ally here in David and a small militia force at his command. And so David asks him to have a small town that he can have as his own, so that he doesn't burden Achish, because up to this point, David is living, when he gets to Gath, David and his men are living off the king's hospitality. And so David doesn't want to be beholden to the king. And, it's a precarious situation to be in because the king changes his mind. He's right there and all those kinds of things. And I think at the same time, I think there's probably some pride involved and some independence involved. And he doesn't want to be that close under the king's thumb because he is not loyal to the king of Gath, to Achish. He just is looking for protection. And so
He feels no loyalty to Achish.
there's no loyalty whatsoever.
He's the king, he's the uncrowned king of Judah.
Yeah.
And he's not gonna want his potential enemy looking over his shoulder at everything he's doing.
Yeah, so David doesn't want to be under the thumb of Achish. He doesn't have any loyalty to Achish. This is merely a move of, he thinks he's safer here than he is with Saul. And so he's asking for his own territory, his own city, his own place where he can kind of have a little bit more free reign, some freedom, can entertain and do whatever he sees fit.
And he can maintain relations with his allies who are still in Judah.
Yeah, and maintain those relationships as well, as we see is what happens. And so Achish gives him Ziklag, which is a town to the south. It's really a border town between Judah and Philistia. It's in Philistia. It's a Philistine territory, but it's right on the border between the two. It's really in the wilderness area. And so some people have said that here David is the sheriff of Ziklag. Kind of this idea, commentators will talk about, he's the sheriff of this area. Think like the Old West, where you're keeping order in that territory, that area. That's really kind of what David's doing. That he's keeping order in theirs. And Achish thinks it's for him. I got David there. I don't have to worry about Judah coming in and outflanking me from the south or from the east. And I don't have to worry about the Amalekites or others coming up from the south onto my territory. So for Achish, for him, he doesn't see a downside to this. But we'll see David's cunningness and craftiness and cleverness here as we finish this chapter. Now David and his men went up and made raids against the Geshurites and the Girzites and the Amalekites, for these were the inhabitants of the land from of old, as far as Shur to the land of Egypt. And David would strike the land and would leave neither man nor woman alive, but would take away the sheep, the oxen and donkeys, the camels and the garments, and come back to Achish. When Achish asked, where have you made a raid today? David would say, against the Negev of Judah, or against the Negev of the Jerahmeelites, or against the Negev of the Kenites. And David would leave neither man nor woman alive to bring news to Gath, thinking, lest they should tell about us and say, so David has done. Such was his custom all the while he lived in the country of the Philistines. And Achish trusted David, thinking, he has made himself an utter stench to his people Israel, therefore he shall always be my servant. Right, so David there is wise in Ziklag. He is providing for his men, his people, all those by raiding the towns and villages around him. And he devotes all of the people to destruction. He leaves no one alive so that no one can report back of what he's actually doing. He takes the plunder, he gives some to Achish and Gath, and he asks, well, where have you done this? And David's like, oh, against the towns of Judah and against Judah's allies. And so Achish,
really raiding against Israel's old time.
so he's raiding against, as he raids against as he tells Achish it's against Judah, Achish thinks, oh, David is mine. He has nowhere else to go because they won't take him back in Judah now. He's going to be my servant now forever because no one in Judah is going to take him back after he's killed their friends and family. But as Tom pointed out, what he's actually doing is he is killing Israel's longtime enemies. Remember, Saul's already attacked some of these guys and gone after them for what they've done before. And so David is while David is playing nice with Achish and telling him one thing, what he's actually doing is he's fortifying, he's cleaning up Israel's southern border of all its enemies. And so by the time when it comes time for David to actually be king, there are no more threats left to the south. David has solidified that. And so his coalition of Judah is firmly entrenched behind him because there are no enemies that are really around anymore, because David spent 1.5 years cleaning them up with the protection of the Philistines while he's able to do that. All right. So really the cleverness, the craftiness of David in order to provide for himself, to keep himself safe, but also to lay the groundwork for even the stability of his future kingdom, because there aren't really any enemies on the southern border that can go against him anymore. Okay.
Does David understand that he's going to be the next king?
He believes God's promise. I mean, that's what he was anointed for. When Samuel anointed him, this is, you will be the next king. And so, Samuel's dead, all of these things, but this is what Samuel set in motion when he anointed him. And so David doesn't know how, he doesn't know when, but he trusts in God's word that he will be the next king. We see that even from the previous chapter about the how and the when. Maybe God will strike Saul dead. He hasn't done it yet. Or maybe Saul will die of natural causes. And so David might be thinking that could be a year from now, that could be 20 years from now. Or maybe Saul will die in battle. But all I know is that it is not right to lay a hand against the Lord's anointed. You can't do that and remain guiltless. And so however Saul dies and I become king, right? That's really what's implied there, I think, is that he understands that he's going to be the next king. And it's only when Saul dies that will happen. But he is not going to make it happen to have Saul perish.
Saul even affirms that, when he says, don't destroy my descendants.
And Saul recognizes that, he sees that. That's why he gets upset with Jonathan earlier. You're basically, hey, Jonathan, you're handing your kingdom to David. He's already been anointed. Now you're just handing it to him by being friends with him. And then when David confronts him these 2 times, Saul says, I know you're going to be the next king. I know that this is, and so don't wipe my line out when this happens. So, yeah. Oh, yeah. I think Saul believed it, which is what made Saul crazy and do the actions he did. He believed that David was going to be this next king unless Saul did something about it. But at the same time, I think he was trying to manipulate and butter David up too. I think you can do both of those things. And I think Saul was. Yeah. All right. So how is God protecting and preparing David? I asked that question last week as well. So we see God's protection of David. We see that David's hiding just in the exact right cave and allowing Saul to come into that cave. And we see that as God has Saul's army be sleeping. We see the protection of David, even in his pureness of heart, if you will, through Abigail. You see the protection of David, even as he's granted favor in the eyes of Achish, and as God protects him on the battlefield. Any other ways we see God protecting David in these chapters? Provided wives for different areas and the connections that they offered, and probably or possibly the resources that they offered and the relationships that they offered with others. Yeah. Yeah, good. So Jonathan is still around, but not with David. He has that, last week we talked about how Jonathan came and visited him briefly. And I believe that's the last time that they interact, that scripture tells us about. And so Jonathan is either, He doesn't seem to be in this group of 3,000. He could be, but he doesn't seem to be, just for, I mean, it's not mentioned that he is. So, I mean, it's possible that he could be, but more than likely he's on his own campaign somewhere, or he's defending the capital in Gibeah while Saul's out making his raid, you know, whatever that might be.
It sounds like he's, I mean, this one we don't know, we'll find out next week, I think. We're finishing
Yeah.
next week.
Yeah.
He reconciles in some way with Saul, because he's with Saul when he died.
Yeah, so Jonathan and Saul, you know, at one point Saul hurls the spear at Jonathan and calls, you know, his mother all sorts of names. But he at least reconciles with Jonathan enough that they can fight side by side. So Jonathan is a good prince of Israel. You know, even though his dad is not a good king. Yeah. So at the same time, God is also preparing David to be king. Just as you mentioned his wives, Michelle, not only was God protecting him through that, but he's also preparing him with the relationships and the diplomacy needed there. He's learning how to interact with other heads of state with Achish. He now just doesn't have this roaming band. He's actually got a city and its government to maintain and to judge and administer to protect the city. He still is improving his military raids, and he's also fortifying his southern flank, if you will, of the southern border of Judah. So, I mean, all of these things, God is preparing David also to be king. Even with, I think the importance of Abigail can't be overlooked, to listen to wise counsel. That a king doesn't have to have and doesn't have all the answers, and needs people to remind him of what's right and good and proper in the eyes of the Lord. And so David surrounds himself with these people too. And I see that clearly as, you know, God protecting David, but also providing for him wise counsel. Now one of his wives is a wise woman who can bend his ear to do what's right. Now, that doesn't mean David always does, but at least has that support that is there with David, right? And then how has David continued to show his trust in God? For me, I think the biggest one that I see is that he won't harm the Lord's anointed. He doesn't take the timing of his becoming king into his own hands. He's letting God avenge, God direct, God direct and do it all in his timing. David won't do it himself, which is exactly what Abigail reminds him of to stop him from killing her husband. Yeah. So.
I think he's went someplace outside of Israel. I mean, he could have ran and went far.
So he went outside of Judah, but he didn't go. I mean, he went outside of Judah, but it's almost as close as you can be and be outside of Judah is where he ends up. And so, yes, he's trusting God. He's right there on the edge, ready for God to open the door for him to come back in. So trusting in God to provide. So even though he ran away, he could have ran down to Egypt. He could have, ran all the way up to Syria or something like that. But no, he stays close, ready for God to act. I think that you're right, Michelle. That shows that trust in God.
And he continues to help his people.
It continues to help his people.
Hanging out in Ziklag, hoping for the best.
Yeah.
He actually
Attacks their enemies. These are the people that would have been raiding them year after year and trying to take their crops and their herds. Yeah. And I think even as the interaction with Nabal, what's he doing? He's protecting his people and his people's things, even when he's in the wilderness. So I think that heart is all God is preparing him through all of that to be that protector and that king as he should be. All right.
Archaeological note for those who are interested. They've been excavated for 25 years at Gath, and in the last year, they've actually found an Iron Age gate that David probably would have gone in and out of in Gath, which is kind of interesting.
So Tom just does an archaeological note that's kind of interesting is they've been excavating a long time in Gath. Gat is how you pronounce that in Hebrew. And they found an Iron Age gate, which would have been there lined up to be a gate that would have been around when David was there. So in all likelihood, it's a gate that David walked through. So it's kind of a cool thing.
Also, the guy who found Kiryat Yaakov, which is the Israeli city that they found about 15 years ago that no one thought existed in the Elah Valley, he's been digging recently in the area of Ziklag, and he's found a spot that he thinks may be ancient Ziklag.
Okay.
I've never known for sure where Ziklag
So the other note there is that there's some archaeological work in the area of Ziklag, and they maybe think that they found that too. So kind of some cool things. Again, when we talk about archaeology, I love going into this and looking at this because it gives us a glimpse of what it was or what it might have been. It doesn't prove the Bible right or wrong, but so often what we see is that it reinforces what the Bible says. We don't do archaeology to prove the Bible right, but we're not surprised when it lines up with what Scripture tells us, because it's God's account of how he's worked in history for the salvation of all people through Jesus Christ. And so those are cool when it lines up that way, and we see time and time again that it does reinforce the message and the validity of Scripture. All right. So just as David trusted in God through difficult times, we can too. No matter what's going on in our lives, what we're struggling with, no matter how the world's falling apart around us, David experienced all of that. But through it all, he trusted in God. He trusted in God's timing. He didn't know when or how or what, but he trusted in the Lord to fulfill his promise. And we can do the same thing, that God will always be with us, guiding us, protecting us, and making us and giving us a hope and a future. All right, so with that, let's go ahead and pray. Heavenly Father, thank you for David. Thank you for the example that he sets for us. Thank you even more for David's son. I'm not talking about Solomon or any of his other sons, but David's descendant, Jesus, the one who you established to be king over your people forever, the one who always did what was right, even though it was hard, who had enemies that went against him, that railed at him, that said all sorts of false things. And Lord, you did not spare your wrath from him, but poured it out on him because of our sins. So we thank you for Jesus, for the rescue that he has for us, that because of Jesus, we can be yours and that you have good things planned for us. So continue to be with us this day. Help us, guide us, lead us in all that we do and all that we say. In your name we pray. Amen. All right, everybody, have a great evening. Good to see you guys.